Today's Technique Tuesday is focusing on a technique that is so commonly known, but also just reminding you that there's other ways to use it. So obviously we all love embossing powders, and Emboss Resist is a fantastic technique to use. But we commonly reach for our inks when we do Emboss Resist. So today I'm showing you that it can be used with other media, and I'm going to be using it with watercolouring. Hi, it's Firey here from Pretty Little Button, and welcome back to my channel. So I have this beautiful background stamp from the stamp market, and also two embossing powders because I'm going to do two backgrounds. I'm using the Bublicious, which comes from our lovely Jo Herbert in a beautiful trio, and then I'm going to do one in metallic gold embossing powder as well. So I am just placing the background stamp into my MISTI, and then what I'm going to do is I'm using some distress watercolour cardstock, and I need to make sure that I can stamp this several times without it moving. Now I have ordered a sticky mat for my MISTI, but it hasn't arrived yet. And if you haven't got one of those, just use some repositional tape like I have done, placing it on the back, and then I'm also adding a handle to the back of the card's panel. That just makes it easier later on when I want to add my embossing powder, and I'm not going to get my fingerprints all over the place. So I've placed the card panel over the back of the stamp, and then I'm closing my MISTI backwards. This will allow me to then, supposedly, keep the card panel stuck to the bottom of the MISTI if I press hard enough. But I did find that I didn't actually put enough repositionable tape on the back to begin with. So I had to add a little bit more, and then once I closed it, press down, the card panel stuck to the back of the MISTI and not the actual stamp. So now I know that every time I open and close my MISTI, I can restamp it in the same place and it's not going to move. So I've just prepped the cardstock as well because I did handle it with my fingers as well, so I did put some anti-static powder on there. And then I'm really generously applying ink over that background stamp. Now, Distress watercolour cardstock is textured, and I do like to stamp it a couple of times to make sure I get a really good impression with that textured background. It just means that you'll just get a really good heat emboss impression. So for this first background panel, I am using Bublicious. This comes from the Pink-a-licious trio designed by our lovely Jo Herbert on the design team and our design team coordinator. And I'm just covering this all over the background. Now this is a very fine mix of two types of pinks as well as a fine glitter. And because it's very fine, it picks up the detail on the stamp set beautifully because it is a very, very fine line stamp. You could use a thicker embossing powder or a thicker glitter embossing powder, but you run the risk of it not sticking to all of those areas because of the bigger granules. So because it has got glitter, I do like to heat set from underneath, and I've tried to show this on the camera. It's really hard because I need a bit of distance, but I am heat setting underneath and making sure it melts nicely. Now it is hard to see this one melt clearly on the video compared to when it's in real life, but you can see that change from that sort of matte and glitter embossing powder to a bit of a shine embossing glitter. And I always like to just bring my heat gun over the top at the end just to make sure I've really sealed in all of that powder. And I've trapped all the glitter already, so I won't blow any of that off. I also repeated this and stamped it again on another piece of cardstock, but this time I have just covered it in the superfine metallic rich gold embossing powder. Again, this is superfine, so it keeps that detail, and this is where you can really see that transition. Because there's no glitter, I'm quite happy from heat embossing it over the front rather than the back. Some people prefer to heat emboss all their embossing powders from the back. They feel that it gives a smoother appearance, so do what you prefer. So once I have those all heat set, I'm then ready to do the Emboss Resist. So we've already created all that embossing. If we apply any media over the top, it's going to resist it. Now, as I said, we normally think of ink blending and applying inks over the top of the embossing powder, and that's resisting it, which it is. But we're going to use watercolour media today. So I've switched to my glass media mat because I'm going to have quite a lot of liquid. It just makes it easier for me to clean it up. And I have given a clean, clear wash of water over the top of it, the whole panel, because I want it wet. So when I add the watercolour colours in, it's going to start blending and moving, and you'll get that free fluid movement without you having to sort of manage it too much. I am using a selection of Altenew watercolour pens, and I will have a list of all the products that I've used in today's video down in the description box below, and the full details of each individual colour I used on the blog. I'm just squeezing a little bit out of each of those containers, so I'm using a liquid watercolour here, but you could easily use your watercolour pans as well. Just wet your pans, get a bit of liquid on there first before you then bring it to the actual embossing panel. So this is the wet on wet technique. This is because we are applying wet media to a wet background. You could do this as a wet media to a dry background, but as I say, the wet background helps it become a bit more fluid and move. Or you could do a wet background and then just go directly from a dry pan into there. You may not get as much colour, so it may be a bit paler. Now I went for a rainbow selection of colours, but I didn't go in an automatic straight pattern of rainbow across the card. I was allowing the colours to blend and move and be a bit patchy as to where they are. That did result in sort of when the blue and the orange kind of met a little bit, it was a little bit more muddier, sort of a muddier green. I wasn't too fussed about it. I added a bit more green over the top and it just blended it perfectly. So just bear that in mind when you are doing it in a patchy fashion like I am. You could result in mud. And of course I am just adding the last purpley pink at the bottom and the top just to finish that panel off. So as you can see, there looks like there's a lot of water pooling over that embossing powder, but don't worry. As it dries, it's going to dry off that embossing powder and it will not settle, so you'll get a crisp, clear look. So we're just doing it exactly the same again here, but this time I am doing it with the gold embossed background. And I've gone for a blue, sort of tealy, purpley colour scheme. I really loved how rich this turned out. And obviously these are liquid watercolours, so they're quite pigmented and quite bright and vibrant. If you diluted each of them down with a bit of water, it will make the colour paler and appear more of a pastel look. But always remember that no matter what colour the watercolour looks like when you're first painting with it whilst it's wet, it is always going to dry back lighter. So do bear that in mind. If you start to dilute them too much, you might find that you'll get an embossed panel at the end of it that's watercoloured in a very, very pale wash. So I'm just dropping the colours in, allowing the water to move and blend. And I don't mind where I'm getting sort of more deeper pigments, the pigment pooling in different areas, because it really gives it a beautiful look. And I wanted sort of a tie-dye look, and I think this has really captured it. I wanted it a bit more dark around the edges, so that's why I added more of the dark blues towards the edge, just to really intensify those colours and draw your eye into the middle. So here I've allowed them to dry off, and as you can see, the embossing powder shines through beautifully. All that water that may have been sat over the embossing powder has resisted, has dried off, and the embossing powder is seen beautifully. So remember, you don't have to just use inks, and if you don't have inks and you're just dabbling in embossing powder but you've got watercolour paints, well, why not try Emboss Resist? So to finish these two cards off, I trimmed the rainbow background down so I got a bit of a white border just to frame it. And then I'm using a Pocketfull of Happiness dies here. I've got the Hey There die, and this cuts out the shadow, it cuts out the outline, and then it also cuts the thin letters. So I have used the shadow and the thin letters here in some gold mirror cardstock. And I've created a sort of dimension to the sentiment by layering up the background shadow piece, 3 layers of those white die cuts, and gluing them together to create that dimension, and then just adding the thin gold mirror letters over the top. To adhere them to the card, I've just used liquid adhesive and my T-ruler to line it up and just place them towards the top. I'm really keeping this simple because it's a really big bold sentiment, and also I feel like the colours in the background are really the star of the card, and I don't want to add anything that detracts away from that. Now, when you die cut the Hey There, it creates an outline cut as well. So it created an outline cut for the gold versions. So I then added them to a shadow outline, and then that created my second sentiment. Now for this card background panel, I wanted to create an eclipse feature, so I die cut a circle out of the middle, and I added about 3 or 4 die cuts of scrap card behind it just to raise it up. And this just helps sort of draw your attention to the middle of the card where the sentiment is. It adds a little bit more interest and focal point to the card without actually detracting away from the sentiment or that background panel with the heat embossing and that variation in the colour. To finish both of these cards off, I did use a selection of gold sequin discs. These come from Lucy's cards, and I use, for the blue card, I use gold sequin discs, and for the rainbow card, I use a rainbow selection of gold sequin discs. And as you can see, as I turn it in the light, you get all that beautiful gold metallic embossing powder shining through that background. And when we do it on the rainbow one, you get a variation with that soft pink pastel embossing powder, and I think that paired beautifully with the rainbow inspired background. So let me know in the comments below which one out of these two is your favourite. I do love a good rainbow, but I absolutely love the colours in the blue background, especially the intensity around the edges. If you're new to the channel, why not think about subscribing? You can hit that bell icon to be notified when my next video is up. And until next time, happy crafting!